Um, and I'm here to facilitate this conversation. I'm certainly by no means the expert here. I think we're all bringing our expertise to this roundtable, and our roundtable series is intended to give space for informal conversations on topics that are important to us around philosophy in education. And Cassie, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. I'm Cassie Finley. I am on the academic advisory board here at Plato, and also the media committee, and do some of the behind the scenes things. And I am studying philosophy at the University of Iowa. So excited to hear from you all, your thoughts on things. And yeah, looking forward to it.
Cool. Thanks, Cassie, and thanks for your support in all of this. So we'll introduce everyone else who's here in just a moment. I'm going to start things off with some remarks, which may or may not provide any insight at all. So I have been an educator for the last 14 years, and I currently work for the City of Seattle's Department of Education Early Learning. But I started out my career in education in Santa Fe, New Mexico, teaching Latin to 7th and 8th graders. And the interesting thing about that job was, it was my first job teaching ever. Also, I didn't know any Latin, and had just been handed this class and told, like, run with this. And stay a chapter ahead of the kids. And I was young and foolish enough to believe that I could do that successfully. So, of course, the first day of class, the first day that I ever taught anything, I had a group of 7th graders in front of me, and I asked them to, introduce themselves and tell me any languages that they might have studied before, because I was interested in seeing if we could make some connections to the Romance languages. And as they started introducing themselves, I learned that 4 of the students in my class had more Latin education than I did. It was terrifying. It was an utterly terrifying experience. And I bring that up because that was not far off from my experience of teaching philosophy and entering the world of philosophy in schools. I taught for about 8 years at a school in South Seattle, a high poverty school called Rainier Beach High School that was in the process of implementing its international baccalaureate program. And as a part of that work, I was the IB coordinator. I was also given the theory of knowledge class, which some of you may be familiar with. And I don't, despite the fact that I'd been teaching for 4 years by the time I took that role on, I don't think that I really knew what inquiry was, or teaching with inquiry was, until I had the experience of teaching theory for the theory of knowledge class. It's kind of a philosophy, for those of you who may not be familiar, it's kind of a philosophy class, it's kind of not. I mean, it's definitely about epistemology, about how we know what we know, but there's very little required in terms of teaching history of philosophy or studying big name philosophical thinkers. So given the fact that I had 0 formal background in philosophy, that was a good thing for me. I wasn't going to have a ton to teach the students unless I was staying a chapter ahead, and there was no book, so I couldn't stay a chapter ahead. So the cool thing was I got to approach building the curriculum and teaching the curriculum as a novice alongside my students. And while that's a really humbling experience as a teacher, I think that it really changed the way that I approach teaching, period. And that's the topic of today's conversation, is how does doing philosophy impact your teaching practice? So I definitely had my fair share of blunders as I went through that, teaching that course and building out that curriculum. But one of the cool things about it was these are students that I had taught from freshman year, and this was their junior year that I was teaching them in theory of knowledge for the first time. And I started to see them in totally new ways as we started to dig into some of the bigger questions of the course. So, like, how do I know what I know? How do I know who I am? How do I know what's right and wrong? How do I evaluate claims of knowledge from others, and how is that different in different areas of knowledge? So we got to spend a lot of time digging into this. And what I learned was that there were pieces of my students that came alive that I had never seen before. There were students who were really quiet previously, who suddenly wanted to be able to chime in. There were students who had really problematic behaviors in the classes that I had taught them in before, and suddenly they were engaged and kind of clamoring to be a part of the conversation in ways that I had not seen before. And I think I just started to understand that there was a depth to each of them that I hadn't encountered yet. And there's something about like being able to experience that as a teacher, and you all may have similar experiences. There's something about seeing that switch turn on in a student that becomes really addictive. And so what happened to me in the way that I started planning is I went from what I'd been taught in grad school, which is that, you know, you identify a learning objective and you build activities and experiences that are going to help students meet the learning objective, and then you do some formal assessment. And, you know, my planning was really focused on that process. And what switched for me was that suddenly I needed to get a fix of students experiencing ideas with like delight and awe and joy. And so I started building my lessons around what's going to best scaffold that experience for students. Welcome, Gabby. And so, you know, as I started doing that, I think I learned that that there were some pitfalls to that that addiction, which were that I wanted to witness this experience that students had as they were discussing these big ideas always, which meant I was structuring my classes around group discussions that didn't give students the opportunity to experience that in the intimacy of a small group or a partnership, or even just on their own. And I started to learn and grow towards trusting that my students were going to have that experience if I set the class up in the right way. And if I was continuing to be observant and reflective and thoughtful about the kinds of conversations they were having. And, you know, it involved trust, but it was also involved a certain amount of acceptance when they weren't having those experiences, and that's okay. So one thing that I think I need to admit here is that it was a lot easier as someone whose entire class was dedicated and devoted to the work that is philosophy and philosophy adjacent. But I started to try to rope in some of my colleagues too. And so part of that was bringing some of the prompts from the theory of knowledge class to faculty meetings and using them as icebreakers. And then also just kind of probing my colleagues and where could we do some co-planning together. And what was cool about that is I discovered some closet philosophers in my colleagues, including a sports science teacher who really wanted to be able to incorporate this. And so she started sharing lesson plans with me that she was using around the Haber-Bosch process and the ethical complexity of scientific discoveries that can be used both to kill and to feed massive numbers of people. She had activities she used around inference. And, you know, so through this really started to not only connect with my students and their understanding, their brilliance, and structure my classes around that, but also figuring out ways to find points of connection with my colleagues. So I say that all as a way of jumping into this question of like, how does doing philosophy impact your practice? And I would love first to hear a bit from everybody who's here with us about who you are, where you are, what you do. And then as you feel moved, jump into answering this question for yourself and for the rest of us. So I will move to next to me on my screen, and John would love to have you introduce yourself.